Hello, and welcome back to the Perspectives in History podcast. I'm your host, Willem Connor. Thank you very much for listening, as always. This is part 5 of our series on the Iron Guard, entitled Avenging the Martyrs. No housekeeping announcements to make for this week, so without further ado, let's start the show. In the previous episode of our series on the Romanian fascist movement known as the Iron Guard, we covered events from December 1933 to December 1937. In December 1933, members of the Iron Guard, which was the paramilitary wing of the broader fascist movement known as the Legion of the Archangel Michael, staged a daring assassination of Romania's prime minister, Ion Duca, in retribution for the persecution that the movement had suffered on his orders. The three assassins, known collectively as the Picador, were immediately arrested and sentenced to life in prison. Through their actions, they left a significant mark on the Legion and on Romanian politics as a whole. Within the Legion, the Picador were revered as martyrs for the national cause, as a poem by the Legion's unofficial poet laureate, Radu attests to. Quote, "No one mourns the human prison. The mold on the walls turns sour. Silence flows, black, with the rats and spiders climbing the walls and fungi. And over the wounds of gold and frankincense, through the bars of the dirty walls, a blue sky floods into the prison, pure as a legionary's soul." End quote. As for the Romanian body politic more broadly, Duca's assassination had served as an object lesson to not interfere with the Legion, lest one suffer deadly consequences. Duca's successor as prime minister, George Tatarescu, took heed of this lesson, and adapted a neutral stance towards the Legion. Throughout the nearly 3 years of Tatarescu's tenure as prime minister, the Legion was allowed to conduct its affairs freely and out in the open without fear of government repression. During this time, the Legion was able to greatly expand its activities, and they grew in popularity as a result. The Legion operated hundreds of labor camps across the country, in which its members worked, often side by side with locals, on various construction projects, maintaining roads and bridges, repairing churches, building houses, and so on. These labor camps served a propagandistic purpose. They presented an image of the Legion as selfless, populist champions of the people. Peasants especially were attracted to the Legion, not just because of this, but also on account of their religious message of national salvation. Early in the year 1937, an opportunity arose for the Legion to provide a demonstration of its growing popularity. In January of that year, 2 of its members, Ion Mota and Vasil Marin, were killed in action while fighting as volunteers for the nationalist faction in the Spanish Civil War. The Legionary leadership decided to turn their funerals into a mass rally. The bodies of the fallen legionaries were paraded from town to town across the whole country, at each stop being greeted by crowds of people, peasants, workers, clergy, soldiers, and so on. The largest of these demonstrations took place in the capital city of Bucharest, where, according to pro-Legion sources, hundreds of thousands of people were in attendance. More realistic estimates placed the crowd's numbers closer to 20,000, which, while not quite as high as 100,000, would have still made the funerals of Mota and Marin the largest public funeral in modern Romanian history. Not even Carol I, the widely beloved first king of Romania, managed to net such a turnout upon his death in 1914. Speaking of the monarchy, the King of Romania, at this time, Carol II, took center stage in the latter half of the previous episode. In the past, Romanian kings had not taken much of an active role in the country's politics, but Carol seemed determined to change that. Sources characterize him as an ambitious, power-hungry would-be autocrat with a jealous and insecure disposition. Since taking the throne in 1930, Carol II had constantly searched for ways to enact his political will on the country that he nominally ruled over, but practically had little say in the affairs thereof. The king had long been jealous of the Legion's ability to rally the common people of Romania to their cause, and so, between 1933 and 1937, he alternatively sought to foster competition with the Legion, or to bring it under his control. The stage for a climactic confrontation between the king and the Legion was set when he met with Cornelieu Zelea Codreanu, the founder and leader of the movement, in February 1937. In this meeting, the king asked Codreanu to allow him to become leader of the legionary movement, and in exchange, the Legion would be invited to form a new government, with Codreanu as prime minister. Tempting as this offer was, Codreanu refused on the basis that his leadership of the Legion was something quasi-sacred, not something that could be simply transferred over to anyone else upon request. This meeting, along with a pronouncement about the Legion's aspirations to reorient Romania's foreign policy towards the Axis powers, effectively marked Codreanu for death. If the Legion could not be subordinated to the king resolved to have the entire movement destroyed. The confrontation between the Legion and the Royalists came about against the backdrop of the general election of December 1937. As usual, the government resorted to all sorts of heavy-handed tactics to suppress their political opponents and ensure a favorable outcome. Marches and large-scale gatherings were prohibited, and there were street clashes between the Iron Guard and the Lancieri, the paramilitary formation of the National Christian Party, led by A.C. Cuza and Octavian Goga. Of the four major contenders in this election, the king favored the PNC over the others, and thus worked to skew the election in their favor. Now, we concluded last time before getting into the discussion of this election's results, and since, spoiler alert, this will be the last major election in which the Legion would participate, its results are worth discussing in some depth. So to begin with, the results percentage-wise were as follows. In first place came the National Liberal Party, with 36.46% of the vote. In second place, the National Peasants' Party, with 20.71%. The Legion's electoral formation, the Everything for the Country Party, came in third place with 15.81%, and Goga and Cuza's National Christian Party came in fourth, receiving only 9.29% of the vote. The most notable aspect of these results was that there was no winner, at least legally speaking. As I said, the Liberals came in first place with about 36% of the vote. However, according to the 1926 Romanian Constitution, a party had to receive at least 40% of the vote in order to receive a mandate to form a government. This was the first time an election had produced no clear winner since this aforementioned rule was put into place. It's worth noting that the Liberals may very well have suppressed that 40% threshold had it not been for a dissident faction of the party, which received around 4% of the vote. We'll discuss the consequences that these results would have going forward in a minute, but first I'd like to focus in on the Legion's results in more detail. In the last election in which the Legion competed, that of 1932, they received 70,674 votes, a total of 2.4% of the overall share. This time around, they received 478,378 total votes, again for a percentage of 15.81. This was a significant growth in the Legion's electorate, a nearly six-fold increase. What exactly accounts for this success? Put simply, the 4-year truce with the government of George Tatarescu was responsible. This period was one of steady growth for the Legion, while it engaged in such activities as the creation of the labor camps, and the ostentatious funerals of Mota and Marin, as I previously discussed. Such activities enabled the Legion to make inroads among the general population, and with their populist and religious messaging, they were able to win over large swaths of Romania's peasants, workers, and students to their side. Now, I will not bore you to death by discussing the electoral results region by region, so instead I will read to you the conclusions drawn by historian Roland Clark in his book entitled Holy Legionary Youth, Fascist Activism in Interwar Romania. Quote, even though Codreanu did not gain power, the movement's growth during the mid-1930s was remarkable. Contemporaries consistently attributed the success to the publicity created by the Legion's work camps, businesses, and marches rather than to the assassination attempts and gang violence carried out by certain members. Codreanu's new commitment to peaceful propaganda translated the stated goal of creating the new man into practical legionary activities. Ideology and practice coincided in the work camps and businesses, presenting the Legion as a movement that had fulfilled its promises and had the country's best interests at heart. Issues such as anti-Semitism, which had been a core legionary position in the late 1920s, no longer attracted voters for the Legion because anti-Semitism had become a standard policy for a number of political parties. Nor was the Legion simply profiting from protest votes against the major parties, as they did in the elections of the early 1930s. Rather, legionaries gained votes in regions where they did the most intensive campaigning, and where the electoral apparatuses of the major parties were the weakest. Opposing the corruption of the major parties, the Legion mobilized new social groups for the first time, channeling their votes into what another scholar characterized as fascist authoritarian democracy. The celebrity gained from the funeral of Mota and Marin, and the system of work camps that proclaimed the Legion's commitment to replacing corrupt politicians with honest labor became central to legionary propaganda and rapidly increased their political clout. End quote. Alright, and so with that discussion out of the way, we can move on with the narrative. The results of the election put King Carol II in a difficult position. He had to dismiss the incumbent liberals from government, but he was hesitant to invite the runners-up, the Peasant Party, into government due to their hostility with certain members of his inner circle. Nor did he wish to invite the Legion in to form a government for the same reason. This left him with one option, the PNC. And so, on December 28th, Carol II brought the National Christian Party to power, appointing Goga as the Prime Minister. On the surface, Carol's move had been intended to block the path to power for the Iron Guard. He hoped that by appointing Goga, he could appease the popular demand for fascism, and hopefully undermine the Legion in the process by siphoning away from its base of support. But there were far more sinister motives at play beneath the surface. The king had long harbored ambitions to do away with Romanian democracy entirely, and to establish a new authoritarian regime centered around himself, a royal dictatorship. Historians point out that this was not an uncommon phenomenon in the Balkans during this period, and that Carol was likely inspired to do this by his counterparts, King Alexander I of Yugoslavia and Tsar Boris III of Bulgaria. Similar to these two, the establishment of the royal dictatorship in Romania was premised on the restoration of public order following some sort of political crisis that could seemingly not be resolved through democratic means. As for Goga, despite his espoused loyalty to the monarchy, Carol had a very low opinion of the poet-turned-politician, calling him markedly stupid, and an incompetent statesman whose failings would give the king a free hand to take the stringent measures necessary to do away with Romanian democracy and to establish his personal rule. This had been a gamble, however. Carol could not be entirely reassured that Goga and Cuza would comply with his wishes. In order to keep them in check, he stacked the cabinet with figures whose loyalty he could be more certain of, including two individuals who will be particularly relevant to our narrative going forward, Ion Antonescu and Armand Călinescu, both of whom I will now provide an introduction for. Ion Antonescu was a high-ranking officer in the Romanian army, who first made a name for himself during the Peasants' Revolt of 1907, and going on to serve with distinction during the Great War. He spent the last 2 decades since the war's conclusion serving in various postings at the highest echelons of the diplomatic corps and the army's general staff. Nagy Talavera describes Antonescu and his reputation in the following manner, quote, "Small, red-haired, strong-willed, determined, with a volatile temper, and a strong will that earned him the nickname of Red Dog, he was a true Romanian patriot in the sense that he always looked at the nation's interests. He was as much feared as he was respected in the leading circles of Bucharest in general, and with the armed forces in particular. Everybody, including the king, knew that he was the kind of person that one must not cross unless he destroyed him utterly." End quote. Armand Călinescu, by contrast, was an economist by trade, and had served for quite some time in the Interior Ministry. He was nicknamed the Black Monocle for his distinctive black monocle he wore after losing an eye to an infection in his childhood. Călinescu is described as being forceful, ruthless in the pursuit of his goals, although his motives were almost entirely self-serving. Nonetheless, King Carol seemed assured of Călinescu's loyalty and his ability to carry out the royal will. As far as the Iron Guard was concerned, Călinescu and Antonescu were polar opposites. Călinescu was staunchly opposed to them and had long been pressuring the king to take a firmer stance against them, whereas Antonescu was very much sympathetic to the legionary cause. He had many personal ties to the Legion, including a personal friendship with the captain himself. In short, King Carol II's appointment of Octavian Goga as prime minister was a highly calculated move on his part. What he had perhaps underestimated was the sheer depth of Goga and Cuza's racial animus towards the Jews. Under Goga, the government unleashed a reign of terror against Romania's Jewish population. One of the first acts of the Goga government was to promulgate a decree forcing all Jewish citizens of Romania to reapply for citizenship. The process was intentionally made as opaque and difficult as possible, and as a result, 250,000 people, about 1/3 of Romania's Jewish population, was effectively stripped of their citizenship entirely. Jewish businesses were forced to close down, and most Jews working in the public sector lost their jobs. A massive exodus of Jews from the country ensued. The effects on the Romanian economy were considerable, as were the effects on Romania's international standing. The French, British, and American governments all lodged formal complaints, while the Soviet Union broke off diplomatic relations entirely. In an interview given to Time magazine, Goga attempted to provide a justification for his policies. Quote, "The Jewish problem is an old one here, and it is a Romanian tragedy. In short, we have far too many Jews." End quote. But the Jews were not the only group of people targeted by the Goga government. Their primary political opponents, the Legion, were naturally also singled out for repression. By January 1938, intense street battles between the Iron Guard and the Lancieri claimed the lives of at least 4 and resulted in the wounding of 52 others. Goga and Cuza believed that by solving the Jewish problem, all the other issues facing the nation would be resolved. In reality, all that they accomplished was alienating Romania's traditional diplomatic allies, most of the domestic political establishment, and, most importantly, the king. At Goga's request, Carol dissolved Parliament in late January, with plans to hold elections in March. In the meantime, the government struggled to find political allies with whom they could form a coalition. Suddenly, in February, the Legion and the PNC agreed to a truce, and negotiations began to invite the Legion into government. This was an unacceptable proposition for Carol, and on February 12th, Goga was abruptly dismissed from office. In his farewell address, he blamed who else but the Jews for his failure, proclaiming, quote, "Israel, you have won." End quote. Goga suffered a massive stroke and died 3 months later. Addressing his people on the same day that Goga was dismissed from government, King Carol announced, quote, "In hard times, only heroic methods can strengthen Romania, the salvation of which is our supreme law, which I will obey without hesitation." End quote. The heroic methods that Carol resorted to involved the suspension of the Constitution, the canceling of upcoming elections, the declaration of martial law, and his assumption of dictatorial powers. He also appointed a new, entirely non-elected government, led by the Patriarch of the Romanian Orthodox Church, Miron Cristea, although the true power behind the throne was Călinescu, who was appointed as Minister of the Interior. According to the king himself, the priorities of this new regime were to be the depoliticization of the government, the promotion of Romania's national interests, and the maintenance of the country's traditional foreign policy. A week later, a plebiscite was held for a new constitution. The plebiscite, as was par for the course in interwar Romania, could not be considered democratic even by the standards of the day. Fearing retribution, the electorate voted overwhelmingly in favor of the adoption of this new constitution. Said new constitution, although superficially similar to its 1926 predecessor, in that the existence of a parliament and separation of powers were maintained, it effectively concentrated all political power into the hands of the king, granting him the sole right to appoint and dismiss members of the cabinet, veto power over all laws passed by Parliament, and even the ability to issue royal decrees while Parliament was not in session. Certain provisions of the new constitution even seemed to be directly aimed against the Legion. For one, it stipulated that any member of the government had to be at least a third-generation Romanian citizen. If you'll recall from the first episode, this was not the case for Codreanu, whose father was a first-generation Romanian citizen. Most historians characterize the royal dictatorship of King Carol II and the constitution that provided its legal underpinnings as fascist and corporatist in character. And while one could argue that this distinction is not entirely accurate or question Carol's ideological commitment to fascism, one must acknowledge that the king appropriated much from the ideology of the avowedly fascist Iron Guard, as evidenced by their adoption of the tripartite slogan, faith, work, and the national idea. If there was any man in Romania who was able to resist the imposition of this new royal dictatorship, it was Cornelieu Zelea Codreanu. He, of course, led one of the most powerful, fastest-growing political formations in the country, along with its paramilitary wing. But Codreanu would not commit to opposing the king. In fact, he proved this by formally disbanding the Everything for the Country party and restated his renunciation of using illegal or violent means to achieve power, saying, quote, "We wait for our victory to come about through the completion, in the nation's soul, of human perfection. We will not use violent means, because our historical mission and responsibility are too deeply rooted in the consciousness of today's youth to allow for thoughtless actions that would transform Romania into a bloodied Spain." End quote. Rather than engage in violent resistance, Codreanu issued the following instructions to all legionaries. Quote, "Read several times a day the oratory of the Virgin Mary. Do not read books or newspapers. All forms of entertainment that can distract the soul of the legionaries from prayer are forbidden. Do not smoke, nor eat, nor pay visits on Friday. Devote yourself entirely to prayer. Do not play cards, do not attend shows. The focus will be on the victory against time and matter, the liberation of the soul from the yoke of matter. Focus on prayer, in order to get closer to the saints, the dead, to the Redeemer, Jesus Christ, and to God. Invoke our dead to pray with you. Call on Mota." End quote. The captain's passivity in these circumstances is perplexing. Sources sympathetic to the Legion, like the memoirs of Michel Sturza, portray Codreanu's decision as a selfless, noble gesture. Quote, "The captain felt that he had no right to expose his thousands of young partisans to this new ordeal, prisons, tortures, and assassinations." End quote. Codreanu was certainly not naive. He must have understood that the king was determined to eradicate the Legion, and moreover, that non-aggression would not suffice to save it from its opponents. It's worth noting that not all of his followers agreed with the captain's decision. Most favored a policy of active resistance against the royal dictatorship, while a minority still believed that it was possible to make a deal with the king. Shortly after Carol's seizure of power, Codreanu wrote an open letter to his legionaries, in which he clarified that the disbanding of the Everything for the Country party was a formality, and that the legionary movement would persevere. He attempted to raise the legion's morale with the following message. Quote, "The legion must retreat now and wait for better days. The Carolist dictatorship will not last." End quote. Codreanu cited the Anschluss, the annexation of Austria by the German Reich on March 12th of that year, as proof that the post-Versailles geopolitical order was falling apart. Some have interpreted this to mean that Codreanu was hedging his bets on the Legion receiving assistance from Germany, but other historians cast doubt on this, seeing as how Goga and Cusa had cultivated far stronger ties with the Nazi Party than the Iron Guard had by this point. Iordachi suggests that a more probable explanation for Codreanu's passivity in the face of imminent persecution has to do more with the Legion's propensity for sacrifice and his conviction that sacrifices would benefit the Legion in the long term. Codreanu's opponents had often accused him of having a death drive, and as we'll ultimately see, it wouldn't be until Codreanu had made the ultimate sacrifice that the Legion would finally achieve power. Of course, the decision to engage in passive resistance may have in fact been a pragmatic one, the result of the Legion's limitations. While they had undoubtedly grown in their membership and popularity since the last round of persecution, the Legion still lacked the capacity to resist the government by violent means. The decentralized organizational structure of the Legion may have had its benefits, but it was likely to prove a liability when attempting to wage armed resistance against the state. As for the Legion's paramilitary training and martial ethos, these things would not amount to much, as the Legion had no significant stockpiles of weapons to speak of. In April 1938, the government crackdown against the Legion began in earnest. On the 15th of that month, the king issued a decree for the defense of state order. This ordinance forbade all political organizations not expressly approved of by the king, with a special emphasis on rooting out clandestine, paramilitary, or terrorist activities. Furthermore, any and all activities undertaken for the purpose of overthrowing the current regime were prohibited, as were any activities that, quote, "propagated the principle of class struggle or advocated the abolition of private property," end quote. Based on the wording of certain parts of this decree, it would seem that it was partially directed at the communists, but other articles of the decree made it very clear that the Legion was the real intended target of its effects. For instance, Article 6 prohibited oath-taking ceremonies. Articles 7 and 9 prohibited the wearing of uniforms in public and paramilitary activities of any kind. Article 10 prohibited political propaganda, either by way of print or by public group singing. Article 25 prohibited students and priests from engaging in political activities, and so on and so forth. The penalties for violating any of these articles ranged from fines, imprisonment for 1 to 2 years, and the loss of civil rights for a minimum of 5 years. As soon as this decree was enacted, Călinescu got to work. A wave of arrests ensued, one of the first of which was carried out on the evening of April 16th. 44 high-ranking members of the Legion were arrested, including Codreanu, his father Ion, the poet and playwright Radu, the philosopher Ne Ionescu, and George Clime, the president of the now-defunct Everything for the Country party. The pretext on which Codreanu had been arrested was an allegedly slanderous letter that he had written to Nicolae Iorga, dated March 26, 1938. Iorga, who was around 67 years old at the time, had enjoyed a long career as a historian and statesman, and was notoriously anti-Semitic in his own right. Codreanu and the founding members of the Legion actually looked up to Iorga as a role model, and thus they saw it as a betrayal when he openly sided against the Legion and joined Carroll's government as a counselor of state. Iorga openly criticized the Legion for, of all the things that one could criticize them for, their commercial ventures and charity work. Codreanu responded by calling Iorga a dishonest opportunist who betrayed the nationalist ideas he once claimed to stand for. Iorga responded in turn by filing a formal complaint, which Călinescu wasted no time in acting on, having Codreanu arrested and charged with offense to a high official. Prince Sturza reprinted the offending letter in his memoir. It reads partially, quote, "When, 15 years ago, the youth loudly demonstrated against the Jewish conquest, no more noisily than yourself in 1906, today's gentleman told us, that is not how you will solve the Jewish problem. Take up trade like them. Here we stand, our souls full of hope, longing for work. But when you saw that we were fair, that we were capable, that our work was blessed by God, here you come to stamp out our trade, to stifle our hopes and our enthusiasm. What epithets can I give you? What word in the Romanian language would suit you? You accuse us of having made mistakes in the past, but whom among you has not erred? Tell us what we have done wrong now. Are you making a crime out of what you yourself urged us to do but yesterday? You, Professor Iorga, who was just 4 months ago raising the alarm about Christian trade destroyed by Jews, even appealing to violence, now comes to slander us, the Romanians. Under the happy Christian governance of His Holiness Patriarch Miron, there is no longer a Jewish problem in Romania. There was no one left but us who must be destroyed by any means. We have never uttered a bad word for Professor Iorga, nothing but respect and courtesy, and yet he has been raining venom on us for some time now. It is said that behind these businesses we plot, we plan terrible violence, we want to kill people, souls of assassins, people with revolvers in their pockets. I can no longer stand it. From the limits of my human powers which once respected you, I cry out to you. You are an unjust person. You are a dishonest man at heart. I cannot fight you. I do not have your intellect, your age, your ability. I have nothing. You have everything. But from the depths of my wounded soul I cry out to you, and I will continue to cry out to you from this abyss of despair. You are a dishonest soul, for you have unjustly slandered us. You who accuse us of violence, after having endorsed all the violence against us. But even after all the torment and humiliation that you have subjected us to, we will prove that we will not react to your provocations. You may stifle our trade, beat us, send us to the island of snakes, stone us to death, hang us by the neck, you, Professor Iorga, and all the others who have assumed responsibility for this bloody and unjust repression will not encounter violence or even opposition. From now on I will close my eyes, Mr. Iorga, and I will look upon you as you deserve." End quote. The trial was conducted hastily and in secret. Codreanu was found guilty and sentenced to 6 months of hard labor. Even from prison, Codreanu continued to discourage his followers from taking drastic action. He advised them to, quote, "hide yourselves in the woods, the mountains, or wherever you can." End quote. He pointed out that any open violence would just be met with further retaliation, and that he and the others in prison would be the ones to pay the price for it. He advised the Legionaries to, quote, "be as abstinent and as religious as you can in preparation for the final battle for power." End quote. No one was convinced that a 6-month sentence would be sufficient to eliminate the threat posed by Codreanu. In order to keep him imprisoned indefinitely, further charges were brought against him in May of that year. This time, the charges were more serious in nature. 7 in number, they were as follows. 1. The creation of organizations among the youth. 2. The distribution of circulars containing instructions for and incentives to violence. 3. The organization of firing drills. 4. The organization of a secret information service. 5. The possession of secret documents. 6. Connections with foreign organizations. And 7. Inciting rebellion against the government. In summary, each of these charges, if proven true, would be tantamount to high treason. The ensuing trial has been characterized by Codreanu and his supporters as a show trial, and it is difficult to argue against this claim. Legally speaking, the trial was full of irregularities, far too many for me to go through. Entire monographs have been dedicated to this trial. But the most important thing to bear in mind is the political purpose the trial served. As Constantin Iordachi points out, the specific charges had been drawn up not just for the purpose of neutralizing Codreanu politically, but by casting the Legion as agents of foreign machinations, they sought to neutralize their nationalist appeal, and in doing so frame loyalty to the royal dictatorship as the only path towards national salvation. The trial concluded on May 27th, and did so with the predetermined result. Codreanu was sentenced to 10 years of hard labor. He was held in the infamous Jilava prison, where many of the country's political prisoners, including the members of the Decemviri and Nicodori, the two famed Legionary death teams, were already being held. And now, a word from our sponsor. And now, back to the show. With the arrests of most of the Legion's top leadership, the movement had been effectively decapitated. Although the Legion did continue to exist, and its members shared the captain's conviction that international developments would turn the situation in their favor, they were scattered and decentralized, and as such they had been all but neutralized as a viable political organization. Fearing being caught up in the subsequent waves of arrest, most rank-and-file legionaries had little choice but to obey Codreanu's instructions and hide themselves in the wilderness. Others went further, opting to flee the country entirely. This raises the question of why Codreanu himself did not attempt to go into hiding or flee the country, and like many aspects of his conduct during this time, it is very much an open question. Nagi Talavera claims that the prospect of emigrating temporarily to Italy was raised at one point, but Codreanu ultimately decided against it. Others claim that his passport was revoked by the government before he could escape the country. Prince Sturza tried to make use of the connections he'd made as a diplomat to help the captain escape through Poland, but he dismissed the idea out of hand. In any event, many other legionaries did manage to escape, heading primarily for Germany. Once there, most seem to have lost any scruples they may have had about collaborating with the Nazis, ironically the very thing that Codreanu had been accused of in the first place. The leader of the Legion in exile was Horia Sima, a relatively minor figure up to this point. Sima was born in Fagras, a municipality in Transylvania, in the year 1906, making him 33 years old at this time. He had been a high school teacher prior to joining the Legion in 1927. He became a nest leader in the Banat region of western Romania, focusing mainly on organizing electoral efforts. He appears to have been reasonably competent, but no one would have expected him to end up leading the entire movement. Before now, the matter of Codreanu's succession as captain had never been seriously discussed. He was still relatively young, 39 years old, but more importantly, as we saw in the last episode during his audience with King Carol, he believed that his leadership position was imbued with spiritual qualities that made it untransferable. Even now, in prison, Codreanu had a difficult time coming to terms with the fact that he could no longer effectively lead the legionary movement, nor could many of his followers, for that matter. But for the more clear-eyed among them, the question of provisional leadership had to be addressed. The logical successor to Codreanu would have been his longtime second-in-command, Ion Mota, but his death on a Spanish battlefield a year prior precluded this possibility. At first, a 5-man council, including Sima, assumed leadership of the Legion in the immediate aftermath of Codreanu's arrest, but all of them were also arrested in short order, save for Sima, who was yet unknown to the authorities. Prior to Sima's ascendancy, the council had been divided as to what tactics they should pursue going forward. Sima, who apparently lacked Codreanu's scruples when it came to violence, advocated carrying out a campaign of terrorist attacks to avenge the captain's imprisonment. The other members of the council wished to honor the captain's wishes and refrain from such activity. But once they were out of the picture, Sima was essentially given a free hand to dictate orders from Berlin to members of the Legion who were still in the country. Instigated by Sima, legionaries carried out a number of hostile actions against their enemies, both agents of the state and Jews. As the year went on, developments elsewhere in Europe seemed to validate Codreanu's belief that the shifting balance of power would create more favorable conditions for the Legion. On September 30th, 1938, the Munich Agreement was signed, whereby France and the United Kingdom acquiesced to the German annexation of the Sudetenland, previously part of Czechoslovakia. It was becoming clear to all that Germany was ascendant, and that the future of the nations in its periphery would depend in large part on their relationship with the Reich. Carol and his inner circle still favored maintaining Romania's traditional foreign policy course, that is to say, their alliance with France and Britain. However, after the Munich Agreement, Karol adopted a policy of cautious rapprochement with Germany. The king remained wary of Germany's designs on Romania, but despite the Nazis' ideological affinity with the Legion, they had not deemed the creation of a legionary regime in Romania as a foreign policy objective. As one German official clearly stated, quote, "We have but one aim, and that is to maintain quiet in the raw material sphere. We do not wish to Germanize Romania or to make her fascist. Any strong government that has the authority to maintain stability there will do." End quote. Had he thrown in his lot with the Axis powers fully, Karol could have stayed on the Nazis' good side and won their support for his regime. However, the king continued to prevaricate, anxious to maintain relations with both Germany and the Western Allies. He was playing a double game. In late November, Karol traveled to Germany to meet personally with Adolf Hitler. What exactly was said between the king and the Führer is not known for certain. We know now that, ideologically speaking, Hitler preferred Codreanu's version of fascism to that of Karol II. Some historians allege that he expressed this opinion, and asked that Karol not only release Codreanu from prison, but also that he appoint him as prime minister. Others maintained that Hitler was more tactful, and avoided making such demands of Karol at this time. Whatever the truth of the matter was, Karol came away from his meeting with Hitler with the belief that so long as Codreanu lived, the Germans may attempt to support him in a bid for power, and that in order to get Hitler to comply with whatever agreement the two of them had made that day, Codreanu had to be removed from the equation permanently. On the morning of November 30th, 1938, the Ministry of the Interior issued a statement announcing that Cornelieu Zelea Codreanu, along with 13 other legionaries, the members of the Decemvirian Nicodori, had been killed during an escape attempt while being transported from one prison to another the night prior. The truth of the matter, which would not come to light until 2 years later, was that Codreanu and the others had their arms and legs bound with rope and were loaded into a truck in the dead of night. They were taken into the Tancabesti forest between Bucharest and Ploiesti, where they were garroted to death and shot in the back for good measure. Their bodies were then loaded back onto the truck and taken to Jalava prison. There the bodies were doused with sulfuric acid and buried in a common grave outside the prison walls. In Germany, the news of Codreanu's assassination was met with outrage. Hitler was reportedly furious, all the more so because the timing of events suggested that he was complicit. While Codreanu's assassination led to a brief diplomatic crisis, Romanian-German relations normalized after a short time. Still, Hitler never forgave Karol for murdering Codreanu, whom he described as, quote, "the man who was predestined to lead Romania," end quote. And when, as we will see, the course of events turned against the king and he was deposed, Hitler would not lift a finger to restore him to power. Codreanu was certainly not mourned in official circles in either Paris or London, and despite the reassurances of Călinescu, who said in an interview with a French magazine that, quote, "the Iron Guard is an old story. The Iron Guard no longer exists," end quote. There did remain a fear that this action would result in backlash, that the king and his government may be unable to survive. Karol did not share this concern. Like Călinescu, he considered the problem posed by the Iron Guard to be more or less resolved. A short time later, in December 1938, the king announced the creation of the National Renaissance Front, a new political party that was to serve as the only legal such organization in the country. Patriarch Christea died in January of the following year, and was replaced as prime minister by none other than Armand Călinescu. Believing that the death of their leader would destroy what remained of the Legion's cohesion and conviction, the authorities began to pressure imprisoned legionaries to sign documents officially renouncing their previous affiliation with the organization. Those that did sign these documents were promised to be released from prison and rehabilitated into civil society. Reactions to the death of the captain among the legionaries themselves were mixed. The belief that Codreanu's death would effectively break the will of the Legion was not entirely unfounded, as many legionaries, having given in to despair, complied with the government and signed the abjurations put before them. Much of the Legion's lower ranks were siphoned off in this manner, leaving behind a core of true believers who remained unflinchingly committed to the cause. For these individuals, denial rather than despair was the prevailing emotion at first. Rumors began to circulate that Codreanu and the others were, in fact, still alive. Some believed that there had indeed been an escape attempt, but that it had been a successful one. The captain had managed to flee across the border into Bulgaria. Others claimed to have seen the captain atop his pale white horse, roving through the forest. Codreanu's widow, Elena, contributed to these rumors by stating that the officials at Jelava prison denied any knowledge whatsoever of her husband's whereabouts. Even after the truth was definitively revealed some time later, some still stubbornly clung on to the belief that Codreanu yet lived. For instance, one legionary gave the following statement, quote, "That is not possible. The captain could not have been assassinated. I go so far as to state my belief that even if they were to find an assassin who is willing to shoot him, the bullet would not leave the gun. I believe in God. I believe in God's justice." End quote. For those who were able to accept the truth, disbelief gave way to rage. The remaining legionaries in Romania scattered across the country began hatching plots to enact violent revenge for the murder of their leader. One group in Bucharest had acquired a number of flamethrowers, with which they planned to set fire to the office of the Interior Ministry. Another group tried to lob hand grenades into the king's box during a horse race. These plots and many others were disrupted by the authorities at the last minute. But then on September 21st, 1939, the Iron Guard finally carried out a successful hit on Prime Minister Călinescu, ambushing his car as it drove through downtown Bucharest, shooting him to death in broad daylight. The assassins then went to a nearby radio station, interrupting a live broadcast of an orchestral concert to proclaim their deed over the airwaves. Călinescu was dead, and the captain, they declared, had been avenged. They then read aloud from a pre-prepared statement addressed to their fellow legionaries. It read in part, quote, "We have decided to punish those who tortured you for your faith in the Romanian people. We acknowledge that violence in itself does not change anything, but it is a painful necessity. We want only that much, that our violence might awaken the Romanian people." End quote. The group then identified themselves as the Răzbunători, or the Avengers. The actions of this death team provoked an immediate intensification of government repression. All 9 of the Avengers, after surrendering themselves to police, were dragged outside of the radio station and summarily shot. Their bodies were left to rot in the street, marked by a sign reading, quote, "From now on, this will be the fate of those who betray the nation." End quote. Similar scenes were recreated nationwide, as scores of legionaries, or, in some cases, suspected legionaries, were also summarily executed, their bodies being hung from lampposts or telegraph poles to be displayed as an example to others. Following Călinescu's death, Carol gave the order to liquidate the rest of the Legion's leaders, many of whom were still in state custody. Much of the Legion's first generation of leadership was killed this way, including George Clime, president of the defunct Everything for the Country Party, Prince Alexandru Cantacuzino, Mihail Polihronade, who is the Legion's resident foreign policy expert, the journalist Ion Banea, and several others. The total number of those killed in this round of repression is estimated between 250 and 300. There was, and I suppose still is, a question of foreign, specifically German, involvement in Călinescu's assassination. Newspapers in Britain and France alleged the crime had been carried out at the direction of, or with assistance from, German intelligence agencies. At the very least, it was highly unlikely that the Germans had no knowledge of the plot, seeing as how the conspirators, chief among them Horia Sima, made the plans for the attack while living in Berlin. Moreover, the Germans had ample reason to want Călinescu gone, given his outspoken support of the Western Allies. In any event, evidence supporting the theory of German involvement is inconclusive, and official German channels, of course, firmly denied the allegation. On September 1st, 1939, the German Reich invaded Poland, thereby starting the Second World War. Romania immediately declared neutrality, but as time went on, it would become apparent that this position was untenable. Public opinion was overwhelmingly on the side of the Western Allies, with many in the media predicting a swift German defeat. However, the rapid conquest of Poland was followed by Germany's attack on France the following spring. As the seemingly unstoppable Nazi war machine continued to overcome all obstacles in its path, Carol and his ministers grew uneasy. With the collapse of France appearing more inevitable by the day, they began to recognize the need to realign the country's foreign policy towards Germany. Some of the more politically savvy among them entreated the king to rehabilitate the Iron Guard so as to appease Germany. Already steps had been made in this direction, as the government had begun to release imprisoned legionaries from custody. Members of the Legion in exile began to quietly slip back into the country in the following months. Agents of the king had even begun negotiations with Sima, in the hopes of getting him to support the government. This process was only sped up after the capitulation of France in June 1940. a short time later, Carroll announced that the National Renaissance Front was to be reformed into a new party, the Party of the Nation. This was to be a different party from its predecessor in that it was more overtly fascistic. The decree announcing the change said as much, quote, "The National Renaissance Front becomes a unique and totalitarian party, under the name of the Party of the Nation. Its main aim is to coordinate the moral and material life of the Romanian state and nation." End quote. The Legion, along with other previously banned far-right parties, were invited to join this reformed government. Eventually, Sima was persuaded to make his peace with the king and was offered a position in his cabinet. He had initially hoped to be given the office of prime minister, but was instead made secretary of education. For this, Sima was roundly criticized by other members of the Legion, and he quit his post after 4 days, perhaps predicting correctly that the royal dictatorship was living on borrowed time. The political situation in Romania was indeed shifting rapidly by the day, and these changes were dependent to a large degree on international developments. The evident weakness of the Allied powers, especially France, had a negative impact on the king's credibility, but if he played his cards right, he might have been able to weather this storm. Then, 2 further developments in the summer of 1940 destroyed what was left of the king's reputation and assured his downfall. On June 25th, the Soviet Union issued an ultimatum to the Romanian government demanding that they cede Bessarabia and northern Bukovina or face war. Without France to guarantee their territorial integrity, Romania was left more or less on its own. Recognizing that the Romanian army could not hope to resist the Soviets militarily, Carroll gave in to their demands. This national humiliation would have been bad enough on its own, but in subsequent months, the proverbial rope around Romania's neck tightened even more. Sensing weakness, Romania's aggrieved neighbors, Hungary and Bulgaria, pressed claims to their territory. In the case of Hungary, they laid claim to Transylvania, a region that had historically belonged to Hungary, and the northern half of which still had a plurality population of ethnic Hungarians. With nowhere left to turn in the face of Hungarian aggression, Carroll asked Germany and Italy to arbitrate the dispute. In August, representatives of all 4 countries met in Vienna to discuss terms. By the end of the month, an agreement had been reached. Known as the Second Vienna Award, or alternatively as the Vienna Dictate, it resulted in Romania ceding a territory of 43,492 square kilometers, or 16,792 square miles, in which lived a population of 2,667,000. Census data for this region is disputed, but most figures indicate that the population was composed of nearly even proportions of ethnic Romanians and Hungarians. Although the Axis negotiators had managed to talk the Hungarians down somewhat from their initial demands, to say that the results of these negotiations were not favorable to Romania would be an understatement. Between northern Transylvania and the territories lost to the USSR, Bessarabia and northern Bukovina, Romania had lost approximately 30% of its territory and population, losses which negated to a significant degree the gains that it had made after the Great War. Now, Carroll and his government may have been able to withstand the loss of the latter 2 territories. Bessarabia and northern Bukovina were rural backwaters, and while handing them over to the USSR was not ideal, most Romanians could go on living without them. The loss of northern Transylvania, on the other hand, was deemed entirely unacceptable. Nagy Talavera describes the public reactions to this loss, quote, "The effect the partitioning of Transylvania had in Romania, especially in Bucharest, was undescribable. Bitterness filled the hearts of the people. Within just 2 months, Romania had lost large territories where the majority of the inhabitants were Romanians. In Bucharest, on August 30th, 1940, it was not an unusual sight to see people weeping in public. The mood was revolutionary. The system that had abandoned 1/3 of the nation's territory without firing a shot and surrendered millions of Romanians to foreign yokes, that system had to go. Great crowds surrounded the statue of Michael the Brave, shouting, 'Let us fight, not 1 acre more.'" End quote. The territorial losses of 1940 caused King Carol II to completely lose the confidence of the Romanian public. Calls for his abdication were going out everywhere, and anti-royalist demonstrations were held in major cities. Amid this revolutionary atmosphere, Sima prepared to stage a coup d'état to overthrow the king. He consciously modeled this plot along similar lines to the 1917 October Revolution that brought the Bolsheviks to power in Russia. The plan was to stage armed uprisings at various localities across the country, including at Cluj, Alba Iulia, Brasov, Ploiesti, Deva, Constanta, Timisoara, and, of course, Bucharest. More specifically, SEMA's plan called for the simultaneous seizure of key buildings in these cities, government offices, radio stations, etc. Once this had been accomplished, it was assumed that the rest of the population would rise up in rebellion against the king. The date for the uprising was set for September 3rd, but as the appointed day approached, SEMA found himself unable to mobilize enough men to carry out such a multifaceted operation, and therefore decided to scale down the plan significantly. With only 1,000 or so men at their disposal, the Legion would concentrate its efforts on Brasov and Constanta primarily, and Bucharest to a lesser extent. The operations in the former two cities were inconclusive. Shootouts between the Iron Guard and police forces in both cities resulted in a handful of casualties on either side, but the Legionaries failed to occupy any strategic buildings. Ultimately, it would be the Legion's actions in Bucharest that would prove more consequential. In the capital, where the government's security was the strongest, the Legion chose to avoid armed confrontation and instead focused on organizing popular demonstrations. Throughout the first week of September, squads of Legionaries distributed seditious leaflets authored by SEMA, full of vitriol against the king and Madame Lupescu. The Legion put themselves at the forefront of these protests, as Nagi Talavera writes, quote, "The crowds wore green shirts as they marched down Elizabeta Boulevard towards the royal palace. They sang songs about the captain, about death and resurrection. Their sad refrains were the expression of the sorrow and frustration of an entire generation. 'Give us the king,' they shouted. 'Give us Lupescu. Don't let them get away with their money.'" End quote. With the angry crowds protesting outside the royal palace growing larger and more agitated by the hour, the king's ability to keep the situation under control appeared doubtful. Members of his inner circle advised him to make General Ion Antonescu the prime minister, as this would hopefully appease the mob. Seeing no other way to prevent a full-blown revolution, Carol acquiesced. On September 4th, the king appointed Antonescu to the office of prime minister, and more importantly transferred his dictatorial powers over to him. Carol may have hoped, perhaps unrealistically, that he might be able to sidestep the demands for his abdication by ceding authority to Antonescu, but this was not to be. The new prime minister pleaded for calm, but the protesters would not stand down. At one point, Carol ordered Antonescu to send in the army to quell the unrest, but he refused, saying that he could not fire on the people so long as no shots were fired in defense of Romanian territory, or something to that effect. Meanwhile, Antonescu approached the leaders of the various other political parties, including Horia SEMA, about the possibility of joining his government. All of them demanded Carol's abdication before they would even consider the offer. After just one day in office, Antonescu recognized that no solution to the political crisis was possible as long as Carol remained on the throne. On September 5th, Antonescu confronted Carol, demanding that he immediately abdicate and leave the country. If he did not comply, his safety could not be guaranteed. Carol took the hint, but only agreed to leave if he was allowed to take as many valuables, gold, jewels, and, curiously, several authentic Renaissance paintings, with him. Carol announced his abdication the next day, and that night he, Madame Lupescu, and their faithful aide Ernest Codreanu fled the capital aboard a train, laden with 9 cars worth of their loot. This greed was very nearly their undoing. Members of the Legion caught wind of their escape and raced across the country to catch up with them. One death squad actually did manage to ambush them at Timisoara, close to the border with Yugoslavia. They opened fire on the train as it passed through the station, with the 3 fugitives managing to evade the hail of bullets by ducking beneath a bathtub. To show his gratitude to the train's conductor for his bravery, Carol offered him $2. The conductor understandably turned it down. The king and his retinue eventually resettled in Mexico City, and later in Estoril, Portugal, a seaside resort town that was a popular destination for Europe's exiled authoritarians. Carol married Lupescu in 1947, and they lived comfortably off their pilfered wealth until the former's death in 1953. The latter died 15 years later. Bringing things back to 1940, Carol's son Michael, then 18 years old, assumed the throne, technically for the second time. He was crowned and anointed according to tradition, but for all intents and purposes, he was to be a figurehead. The real power would lie with Antonescu, whose dictatorial powers were granted by Carol and confirmed by Michael. The new king issued a decree to this effect on the day of his ascension, endowing Antonescu with the title of Conducatorul Statului Roman, in English, leader of the Romanian state. The word conjugator, meaning simply leader, was the equivalent to the German word Führer and the Italian Duce. One of the first major acts of the conjugator was to invite the Iron Guard into government. Their power-sharing arrangement would be formalized on September 14th, when King Michael proclaimed the foundation of the National Legionary State. Romania became, in effect, a one-party state, with the Iron Guard being the only political movement recognized as legitimate by the government. Their goal, as Michael stated in his address to the nation, was to be, quote, the moral and material uplifting of the people, end quote. As if to remind everyone who was really in charge, at the conclusion of the king's radio address, Antonescu shouted, quote, God help the country, His Majesty, and me, end quote. At last, the legionary movement had risen to power. The late captain's dream had been fulfilled. But was the movement prepared to take on the responsibilities of governance? As they would soon learn, the acquisition of power was one thing, but the exercise of it was a different matter entirely. In the next episode of this series in 2 weeks, we will cover the explosive final act of the Iron Guard, their brief time ruling the country, the violent disillusion of their movement, and the sordid legacy they left behind. In the meantime, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, I encourage you to direct them to my email address, perspectivesinhistorypod@gmail.com. I always enjoy hearing from listeners, so your messages are more than welcome. I also encourage you to check out the show's website and to support the show by either purchasing some used books from me or by leaving a review for the podcast on your listening platform of choice. Anyway, that will do it for now. Until 2 weeks from now, this has been the Perspectives in History podcast. Thank you very much for listening. I'm your host, Willem Connor, signing off.